The hum of the temporal field generator filled the room like a swarm of invisible insects. Kale Vera stood at the center of the domed laboratory, his hand resting lightly on the console. Around him, holographic displays projected swirling patterns of light and data, snapshots of infinite possibilities. A dozen observers, dressed in the sterile white of Neoterra's Temporal Research Consortium, sat in rapt silence. The air was thick with anticipation. This, Kale began, his voice steady but carrying an edge of weariness, is the key to our future, or its undoing. His finger hovered over the activation switch. The temporal field reveals not just what could be, but what might already be happening. He pressed the switch. A vortex of colors erupted in the air, forming a window into a possible timeline. It began with a lush cityscape, towering spires gleaming under the light of a stabilized Dyson swarm. Autonomous vehicles floated gracefully, their paths choreographed by quantum AI. People laughed, unburdened by disease, hunger, or strife. It was utopia, dazzling and serene. A murmur spread through the audience. One of the scientists leaned forward, her face lit with awe. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Kale's gaze hardened. "Wait." The vision began to shift. The spires crumbled, swallowed by an unnatural black mist. The laughing people disintegrated into ash. In their place rose jagged machines, their forms alien and unrelenting. The sky fractured like glass, exposing a void where time itself seemed to collapse inward. Gasps echoed in the room. Kale slammed the console, aborting the field. The vortex sputtered and vanished, leaving the laboratory eerily silent. "That," he said, his voice sharp, "is why we must tread carefully." "Was that inevitable?" one of the observers asked, breaking the silence. His voice quivered, a mixture of fear and curiosity. Kale shook his head. "No. It's a possibility. The temporal field doesn't predict, it shows what might come if we push the wrong buttons." The lead observer, Dr. Selena Harrow, stood. Her silver hair glinted under the lab's light. "You've made your point, Kale. But the council is pressing for actionable insights. They want guarantees. This ambiguity won't satisfy them." "Guarantees?" Kale let out a bitter laugh. "The only guarantee is that the future is fragile. And now, someone is tampering with it." The room stilled. Dr. Harrow narrowed her eyes. "Explain." Kale turned to the console, typing rapidly. "The temporal field has been destabilizing for weeks. At first, I thought it was a calibration issue. But after analyzing the data, he brought up a diagram showing erratic spikes in the field's resonance. These patterns aren't random. Someone is hacking into the field. And they're trying to rewrite our future." The murmurs returned, louder this time. Dr. Harrow raised a hand, silencing them. "Do you have proof of who's responsible?" Kale hesitated. "Not yet. But I found traces of encrypted data in the temporal nodes. Whoever it is, they're operating on a scale far beyond conventional technology." "This isn't an amateur." A sharp beep interrupted him. Kale glanced at his wristband, where a message blinked in urgent red. "Did you think you could hide from me, Kale? Time reveals all." He froze. The signature at the bottom of the message was unmistakable, Zara Loon. "Kale?" Dr. Harrow's voice was tinged with concern. "What is it?" "Zara," he said quietly, his mind racing. "She's alive." The room erupted in shocked voices. Zara Loon had been presumed dead for years after her controversial experiments in temporal manipulation led to catastrophic failures. Now she was back, and clearly playing a dangerous game. Dr. Harrow's face paled. "If Zara's involved, this isn't just sabotage. It's an attack on the fabric of time itself." Kale nodded grimly. "And if she's using the temporal field, she's already several steps ahead." That evening, Kale sat in his quarters, staring at the encrypted message. The words burned in his mind. Zara had always been brilliant, but her obsession with perfecting humanity's future had made her a pariah. Now, it seemed, she was determined to finish what she started, no matter the cost. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of his AI assistant, Lyra. A glowing orb materialized above his desk, its voice calm and precise. Kale, I've analyzed the temporal node's encryption. The code matches Zara's signature from her last known project. Figures, Kale muttered. What else did you find? There's a location embedded in the data. An abandoned orbital station in the exobelt. Kale frowned. The exobelt was a graveyard of failed projects and forgotten dreams, a perfect hideout for someone like Zara. Send me the coordinates. I need to know what she's planning. Kale, Lyra said, hesitating for the first time. If Zara's manipulating the temporal field, confronting her directly could destabilize the timeline even further. And if I do nothing, she locks us into her version of the future. One where humanity's choices don't matter anymore. He stood, grabbing his coat. This isn't just about timelines, Lyra. It's about who we are. As he prepared to leave, Kale glanced out the window at the shimmering skyline of Neoterra. The city was a beacon of humanity's resilience, a testament to what they had overcome. But now, its future hung by a thread. His wristband buzzed again. Another message from Zara. Come find me, Kale. Let's see if you're ready to decide the future. Kale clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. Whatever lay ahead, he knew one thing, the fight for the future had already begun. The exobelt loomed ahead, a glittering ring of debris orbiting Earth like a forgotten mausoleum. Kale piloted his sleek shuttle, its engines humming softly as it weaved through the labyrinth of wreckage. The remnants of humanity's failed projects floated in the void, shattered space stations, derelict ships, and countless fragments of discarded dreams. Approaching target, Lyra's voice chimed, her tone measured but tinged with unease. The coordinates lead to Station Orpheus. Power levels are minimal, but there are faint energy signatures consistent with temporal activity. Kale tightened his grip on the controls. Zara always did love her hiding spots. Keep the scans running. Let me know if you pick up anything unusual. The station came into view, a hulking shadow against the backdrop of stars. Its structure was jagged and asymmetrical, as though it had been hastily constructed or pieced together from scraps. Dim lights flickered sporadically along its surface, casting eerie shadows. Kale docked the shuttle with practiced precision. The airlock hissed open, revealing a dark corridor bathed in faint red emergency lighting. He stepped inside, his boots echoing against the metal floor. The station smelled of stale air and decay, a reminder of its abandonment. Lyra, map the interior, he whispered. A holographic display materialized before him, outlining the labyrinthine layout of Orpheus. Where's the energy signature coming from? Central chamber, approximately 200 meters ahead, Lyra replied. Proceed with caution. Kale advanced, his hand resting on the plasma pistol at his hip. The corridors were silent, save for the occasional groan of shifting metal. As he moved deeper into the station, the walls became increasingly covered in strange markings, equations, symbols, and what appeared to be fragments of timelines. They glowed faintly, pulsing in sync with the station's feeble power. Zara's handiwork, he muttered. She's been busy. The central chamber was vast and circular, dominated by a massive device at its core. The machine was a chaotic assembly of wires, conduits, and spinning components, all pulsating with an unnatural blue light. Around it, holographic projections flickered, displaying fractured images of alternate timelines, a world consumed by fire, another submerged in water, and yet another where humanity lived under the shadow of towering machines. Kale approached cautiously. Lyra, what am I looking at? Analyzing, Lyra paused. This appears to be a temporal stabilizer. But it's been modified, extensively. It's not just observing timelines, it's influencing them. A voice broke the silence, smooth and laced with a faint edge of amusement. You always did underestimate me, Kale. He spun around, his pistol drawn. Zara Loon stepped out of the shadows, her silhouette sharp against the glow of the stabilizer. She wore a sleek, utilitarian suit adorned with intricate circuits that pulsed in rhythm with the machine. Her dark eyes sparkled with a mixture of defiance and triumph. "Zara," Cale said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning inside him. "You've gone too far this time." She smiled faintly. "Far? I've gone precisely as far as needed. The future is broken, Cale. Someone has to fix it. By playing God? By locking humanity into your vision of perfection?" He gestured to the projections around them. "What gives you the right?" Her expression hardened. "The right? The moment we discovered temporal fields, we claimed that right. You've seen the chaos, the endless suffering across timelines. I'm doing what no one else has the courage to do, giving humanity a chance." Cale's grip on his pistol tightened. "At what cost? Free will? The risk of collapsing causality entirely?" Zara stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "Free will is an illusion, Cale. Every choice we make is shaped by forces beyond our control. I'm simply removing the uncertainty, guiding humanity to the outcome it deserves." "And who decides what we deserve?" he shot back. "You?" She sighed, her gaze filled with both frustration and pity. "You're clinging to a broken system, Cale. You always have. That's why you'll never understand." Cale glanced at the stabilizer, its energy intensifying with each passing second. "And what happens if you're wrong, Zara? What happens if your perfect timeline destroys everything?" "I'm not wrong," she said coldly. "But if you're so certain, why don't you stop me?" For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy and charged. Then Cale fired. The plasma bolt streaked toward Zara, but before it could hit, the air shimmered, and the bolt veered off course, dissipating harmlessly. Zara smirked. "Temporal shielding. Did you think I wouldn't be prepared?" Cale gritted his teeth. "You always loved your tricks. And you always relied on brute force," she retorted. "But this isn't a fight you can win with a gun." Cale's mind raced as Zara turned back to the stabilizer, her fingers dancing over a holographic interface. The machine's hum grew louder, its light brighter. He needed a plan, and fast. "Lyra," he whispered, "can we disrupt the stabilizer remotely?" "Negative," Lyra replied. "Its systems are isolated. Manual intervention is required." Cale's eyes darted around the room, searching for a weakness. His gaze settled on a cluster of exposed power conduits feeding into the stabilizer. If he could overload them. "Distract her," he murmured to Lyra. A moment later, Zara's interface flickered, lines of code scrambling across the display. She frowned, her attention momentarily diverted. It was all the opening Cale needed. He sprinted toward the conduits, pulling a plasma charge from his belt. As he reached them, Zara's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Cale, don't!" He ignored her, attaching the charge to the conduits. The stabilizer's energy surged erratically, its projections flickering wildly. Zara's expression shifted from anger to something resembling desperation. "You don't understand what you're doing," she shouted. "If you destroy this, the temporal field could destabilize completely." "And if I don't, you'll rewrite reality," Cale retorted, his hand hovering over the detonator. "I'll take my chances." For a moment, their eyes locked, two visions of the future clashing in an unspoken battle. Then Cale pressed the button. The explosion rocked the chamber, sending him flying backward. Sparks rained down as the stabilizer collapsed in on itself, its energy imploding into a blinding flash. When the light faded, the room was plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of emergency lights. Cale groaned, pulling himself to his feet. Zara was gone, her temporal shield likely whisking her away to another timeline. But the stabilizer was destroyed, its threat neutralized, for now. "Lyra," he said hoarsely, "status?" "The station is destabilizing," she replied. "We need to evacuate immediately." Cale stumbled toward the exit, the ground shaking beneath him. As he boarded his shuttle and launched away from the collapsing station, he couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. Somewhere out there, Zara was still working, still plotting. And Kale knew that the battle for the future had only just begun. The dawn over Neoterra was fractured by the shimmering arcs of the Dyson swarm, their reflections scattering across the city's glistening skyline. Inside the Temporal Research Consortium's high tower, Kale stood before a council of grim-faced officials. His hair was unkempt, his clothes scorched and torn from the chaos aboard Station Orpheus, but his voice was steady. Zara's stabilizer wasn't just a prototype, he said, placing a data drive on the table. It was the first stage of a cascade event. She's locked onto a core timeline and is forcing it into dominance. If she succeeds, every alternate path collapses. We'll lose choice, agency, everything. The council members exchanged uneasy glances. The head of the council, a gaunt man named Aaron Hale, leaned forward. How long do we have? Hours, Kale replied. Maybe less. One of the counselors, a stern woman with sharp features, scoffed. And what's your plan, Vera? Another gamble with the timeline? We've seen how well that worked before. Kale's eyes narrowed. If we do nothing, Zara's timeline becomes reality. You don't have to trust me, but I'll act with or without your approval. Hale raised a hand, silencing the debate. You'll have your chance, Vera. But if you fail, he let the implication hang in the air. Kale didn't respond. He turned sharply and left the chamber, his mind already racing ahead. The clock was ticking. Back in his lab, Kale studied the fragments of Zara's code, projected as glowing patterns of light above his desk. Lyra hovered beside him, her holographic orb pulsating softly. This cascade event, Kale said, it's anchored to a single node. If we can destabilize that node, we disrupt the cascade, Lyra finished. But finding the node amidst infinite possibilities will be complex. Kale sighed, running a hand through his hair. We don't have time for complex. Cross-reference Zara's past actions with major timeline shifts. Narrow it down. As Lyra processed the request, Kale paced the room. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden alert. A new hologram flickered to life, displaying Zara's face. Her expression was calm, almost serene. Kale, she said, her voice echoing with a strange, layered quality. You've come far, but you're still fighting the wrong battle. He glared at the projection. And what battle should I be fighting, Zara? The one where you decide everyone's fate. Her image tilted its head slightly. The timelines are collapsing. I'm not your enemy, Kale. I'm your solution. You're a tyrant, he snapped. Hiding behind your vision of perfection. Zara's expression darkened. This isn't about perfection. It's about survival. Without my intervention, humanity faces annihilation in 92% of probable futures. You've seen the data. Kale stepped closer to the hologram. And what about the other 8%? What about giving us the chance to decide our own path? Zara's image flickered, her calm composure fracturing for a brief moment. Choice is a luxury we can no longer afford. The hologram vanished before Kale could respond, leaving him alone with the weight of her words. Kale, Lyra interrupted, I've isolated the anchor node. It's in the Dyson swarm, specifically, Station Solace. Kale exhaled sharply. The Dyson swarm was humanity's crown jewel, a sprawling network of orbital stations harvesting the sun's energy. Station Solace was its heart, a place of pure innovation and experimentation. Zara's choice of location wasn't surprising. Prepare the shuttle, he said. We're finishing this. Station Solace was a marvel of engineering, its golden panels glowing as they absorbed and redirected solar energy. But as Kale docked his shuttle, he felt a strange unease. The station was eerily quiet, its usual hum of activity replaced by an oppressive stillness. Energy levels are stable, Lyra reported. But the temporal field here is fluctuating. Kale stepped into the station, his plasma pistol ready. The corridors were lined with conduits glowing faintly with Zara's signature modifications. The air seemed charged, heavy with the weight of countless timelines intersecting. The control room was at the station's core, its massive windows offering a breathtaking view of the sun. At the center of the room stood Zara, her figure bathed in the golden light. Around her, holographic timelines swirled in chaotic patterns, tethered to a central device, another stabilizer, more advanced than the one on Orpheus. "You're predictable, Kale," she said without turning. "I knew you'd come." "And you're consistent," he replied, leveling his pistol. "Still trying to save the future by destroying the present." Zara turned slowly, her face illuminated by the holograms. "Do you even understand what you're fighting for? The current timeline is broken. I'm giving humanity a chance to start over." "At what cost?" Kale demanded. "You're erasing everything, every choice, every possibility. That's not salvation. That's tyranny." Her gaze hardened. "You call it tyranny. I call it mercy." Without warning, she activated the stabilizer. The room shuddered as energy surged through the conduits, the holograms stabilizing into a single timeline. Kale fired his pistol, but the shot was absorbed by Zara's temporal shield. "Lyra," he muttered, "options?" "Overloading the stabilizer's core will disrupt the cascade," Lyra replied. "But the feedback could destroy the station." Kale glanced at the device, its components spinning faster with each passing second. "Then we don't have much choice." He darted toward the stabilizer, dodging a blast of energy from Zara's outstretched hand. She moved with unnatural speed, her augmented suit amplifying her reactions. "You can't win, Kale," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Every moment you fight me, the timeline stabilizes further." Kale ignored her, reaching the stabilizer's core. He yanked open a panel, exposing a swirling mass of energy. With trembling hands, he planted a disruption charge inside. "Kale!" Zara's voice was sharp, almost desperate. "If you destroy this, the timelines will fracture beyond repair." He turned to face her, his hand hovering over the detonator. "Maybe. But I'd rather face an uncertain future than live in a world without choice." For the first time, Zara's composure faltered. Her voice softened. "You don't have to do this. We can work together. Build something better." Kale's gaze was steady. "This isn't your decision to make." He pressed the button. The explosion was instantaneous. The stabilizer imploded, sending a shockwave rippling through the room. Kale was thrown backward, slamming into the wall. The holograms shattered, fragments of timelines dissolving into light. When the dust settled, Zara was gone, vanished into the fractured field. The stabilizer was destroyed, its cascade halted. "Kale," Lyra's voice broke through the silence, "we need to leave. The station won't hold." Kale staggered to his feet, his body aching. He made his way back to the shuttle, the station trembling as its systems collapsed. As he launched away from Solace, the station disintegrated behind him, its golden panels scattering into the void. Later, as he stood on Neoterra's balcony, watching the sunrise, Kale felt the weight of his choice. The future was uncertain, the path ahead uncharted. But for the first time in a long while, he felt hope. The future belonged to everyone now. And that was enough.